The airport was full of movement that day. People rushed across the wide terminal, some dragging heavy suitcases, others walking slowly with children clinging to their hands. The announcements echoed above, calling passengers to their gates. In the middle of all this noise and energy, a man walked in quietly. He looked ordinary. No fancy clothes, no loud voice, just a calm presence as he carried a small travel bag over his shoulder. His steps were steady, unhurried, as if he had no need to prove anything to anyone. As he approached the gate, the flight staff barely noticed him at first. They were busy greeting other passengers with wide smiles, especially those in polished suits or expensive dresses. But when the man handed over his ticket, one of the attendants raised an eyebrow. His clothes were plain, and his shoes showed signs of wear. To the staff, he didn't look like someone who belonged in the business class section written on his ticket. They exchanged quick looks, the kind of looks that carry silent judgment. One of them even let out a quiet laugh, thinking the man wouldn't notice. But he did. He noticed everything. Still, he said nothing. He walked down the jet bridge and into the airplane. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and fresh linen. Passengers were already seated, some scrolling through their phones, others adjusting their bags in the overhead compartments. The man found his seat near the front of the aircraft and placed his bag neatly under the seat in front of him. He sat down with a calm dignity, his face expressionless, his eyes watching everything with quiet observation. The other passengers around him barely gave him a glance, but the staff who had mocked him continued their whispers as they passed by, each convinced that this ordinary man must have bought his ticket by mistake or through luck. As boarding continued, the plane filled with chatter. Families settled in, children giggled, and the hum of human life created a soft background noise. The man remained quiet. He did not open a book or take out a phone. He simply sat still, hands resting gently on his lap, his gaze fixed on the aisle in front of him. His calmness stood in sharp contrast to the rush and noise of the other passengers. If anyone had cared to notice, they might have sensed a strength in that stillness, something steady, something rare. But the staff did not notice. Instead, one attendant passed by and whispered to another, "Can you believe he's sitting up here? He looks like he should be in economy." The words carried a sharp sting, meant to wound, though they were spoken softly enough that most passengers wouldn't hear. The man heard, of course. He always heard. But he didn't react. His silence only made the staff more curious, and perhaps a little irritated. People who don't respond often leave others unsettled, and this man's calmness seemed almost unnatural to them. Outside the windows, the airport workers loaded luggage, and the engines hummed as the plane prepared for departure. The captain's voice came over the speaker, welcoming passengers and announcing the expected flight time. Seatbelts clicked into place, bags were tucked away, and the aircraft began to move slowly toward the runway. The staff carried out their usual checks, though their minds still lingered on the quiet man in the front row. They thought him strange, out of place. They didn't know the truth that sat quietly just a few feet away from them. They didn't know the secret he carried. As the plane gathered speed and lifted into the sky, passengers leaned back in their seats. Some closed their eyes, some reached for books or headphones, and others gazed out at the clouds forming below them. The man remained still, his expression calm, almost unreadable. Yet his eyes flickered briefly as the engines roared. For a moment, something sharp, something practiced, flashed across his face. A look that spoke of deep knowledge, of someone who knew every sound, every vibration of an aircraft. But it passed so quickly that no one noticed. The staff continued their duties, still exchanging whispers about the man, their earlier taunts growing into a small private game. They thought themselves clever, entertained by their own judgment. They had no idea that the man they mocked was more than capable of flying the very machine they worked on. They had no idea that the calm figure sitting silently in front of them carried years of training, experience, and the steady nerves of someone who had faced storms in the skies. To them, he was just a quiet, unimpressive passenger. To himself, he was simply traveling home. But soon, everyone on that flight would see him for who he really was. The plane had reached a steady altitude, and the cabin lights glowed softly as the flight staff moved through the aisles. They carried trays, served drinks, and checked on passengers. Most travelers were relaxed, settling into their routines. Some read books, others watched movies on the small screens, and a few leaned back with their eyes closed, trying to sleep. But for the man in the front row, the atmosphere around him was different. The flight staff, who had already whispered their judgments during boarding, now began to act on their assumptions. Their politeness faded into thinly veiled mockery. One attendant asked him with exaggerated cheer, "Are you sure you're in the right seat, sir?" Her smile was wide, but her eyes carried the sting of sarcasm. Another chuckled quietly behind her, shaking his head as if amused. The man remained calm. He gave no reaction, only a polite nod as he confirmed his seat. His silence made them even bolder. Later, when he requested a glass of water, one attendant rolled her eyes before handing it over. "Business class service for everyone these days, I guess," she muttered under her breath. A couple of passengers overheard, shifting uncomfortably, but they stayed silent. No one wanted to get involved. The man, however, did not respond. He sipped his water quietly, his face unreadable. Inside, though, he noticed every word, every tone, every glance. Years of discipline had taught him patience, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Still, their arrogance hung in the air, a shadow over the otherwise calm flight. To the staff, he was just an ordinary passenger, out of place, undeserving of respect. They didn't know the truth sitting just a few feet away. They didn't know that behind the quiet eyes and modest appearance was a man with skills that could one day mean the difference between disaster and survival. And soon, fate would test that truth in the skies above. The flight had been calm for the first hour, cruising steadily above the clouds. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and passengers began to relax into the long journey. Some scrolled through their phones, others leaned back with headphones, and a few were already dozing off. The man in the front row remained quiet, watching the faint glow of the horizon through the small oval window. Everything seemed ordinary. Then it began. At first, it was just a subtle tremor, barely noticeable, like a small shiver running through the plane. A few passengers glanced up, puzzled, but then went back to their distractions. The man's eyes sharpened, though. He recognized the sound, the faint vibration. It wasn't unusual, but it wasn't to be ignored either. His instincts, trained over countless hours in cockpits, told him to stay alert. Moments later, the tremor grew into a strong jolt. The aircraft shook, overhead bins rattling, and a child cried out from the back. Gasps filled the cabin. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on as the captain's voice came over the speakers, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The staff hurried into the aisle, voices raised to calm the passengers. But their nerves betrayed them. Their smiles were tight, their movements rushed. The same attendants who had mocked the man earlier now seemed rattled, whispering anxiously to each other as the turbulence grew stronger. Drinks spilled, bags shifted in the bins above, and panic began to ripple through the passengers. The man sat steady, hands on his knees, eyes calm. While others clutched their armrests in fear, he breathed slowly, assessing. The turbulence was rough but manageable. He had flown through far worse. Still, the vibrations told him something else was happening, something that required more than reassurance. Says. Across the cabin, a passenger shouted, "Is everything okay?" Others began talking nervously, some even praying under their breath. The staff tried to keep control, but their voices trembled. One attendant stumbled, grabbing a seat for balance, her earlier arrogance replaced by visible fear. The man watched silently, still unnoticed by most, still underestimated. Yet inside, he was already calculating, measuring the rhythm of the aircraft, the sound of the engines, the angle of the tilt. He knew something the others didn't. This turbulence wasn't just ordinary weather. It was the kind of challenge that could grow worse quickly if not handled correctly. And deep down, he knew it wouldn't be long before his quiet presence would no longer remain hidden. The first hour of the flight had slipped by peacefully. Passengers had settled into their routines. Children were entertained with tablets. Business travelers typed steadily on laptops, and others leaned back, lulled by the hum of the engines. The man in the front row remained quiet, blending into the background as he always did. He sipped his water slowly, his calm demeanor giving no hint of what was to come. Then, without warning, the plane jolted. It wasn't violent at first, just a sudden shiver that rippled through the fuselage. A few passengers glanced up, frowning, then went back to what they were doing. But the man noticed. His eyes flickered, his posture shifted slightly, his senses sharpened. He had felt this before, the subtle beginnings of turbulence that could turn into something much worse. Moments later, the cabin shook again, harder this time. Overhead bins rattled. Cups slid off tray tables, and one passenger gasped loudly. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a patch of turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." The flight attendants rushed into the aisle, strapping themselves in between rows, while still trying to soothe passengers. But their voices trembled, and their movements lacked the confidence they usually displayed. The same attendants who had mocked the quiet man earlier now revealed a nervous edge. Their forced smiles and hurried reassurances did little to calm the passengers, who were beginning to panic. A baby cried in the back. A man muttered a prayer under his breath. A young woman clutched her armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. The cabin, which had been full of calm chatter, now carried an undercurrent of fear. The man sat still, hands resting lightly on his knees. He breathed steadily, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened to the entourage. Genes, the shifts in pitch, the uneven rhythm of the vibrations running through the aircraft. To him, these were not random shakes of bad luck. They told a story, one he had learned to read after countless hours in cockpits. Something more serious was stirring. A particularly strong jolt threw a flight attendant against a seat, and she caught herself just in time. Passengers gasped. A child screamed. "It's fine, it's just turbulence," another attendant said, her voice too high-pitched to sound convincing. The man in the front row watched them carefully. He could see it in their eyes. They were scared, and when the crew is scared, passengers feel it twice as strongly. The plane lurched again, harder. Drinks spilled, bags shifted in the overhead bins, and a collective cry rose from the passengers. The attendants exchanged worried glances, clearly unsure of what was happening. One of them glanced toward the cockpit door, her face pale. The man finally closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He knew. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. Something deeper was wrong, something that might soon demand more than reassuring words and nervous smiles. For now, he remained silent, letting the fear ripple through the cabin unchecked. No one yet knew who he was or what he could do. But as the shudders grew stronger, as the staff lost control of the situation, and as panic swelled among the passengers, the quiet man's secret would soon no longer be hidden. The skies were about to put everyone to the test. The turbulence that had started as a nuisance was now turning into something much more dangerous. The aircraft rattled violently, trays clattered to the floor, and passengers clung to their seats in growing panic. The hum of the engines no longer sounded steady. There was a subtle, uneven pitch that the average ear could ignore, but not his. The quiet man in the front row leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing. He recognized that sound instantly. Something wasn't right inside the cockpit. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it was strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are experiencing more turbulence than expected. Stay seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." His tone was professional, but to a trained ear, it carried an edge of worry. The man's suspicions deepened. Just minutes later, a sudden announcement rattled through the cabin, an unusual one that no passenger ever wants to hear. "If there are any medically trained passengers on board, please make yourselves known to the cabin crew." Murmurs spread quickly. Something had happened up front. One of the attendants hurried down the aisle, face pale, whispering urgently to her colleague. The gossip that had fueled their arrogance earlier was now gone. Their eyes betrayed real fear. They had just learned that the co-pilot had collapsed, unable to continue flying. The captain was alone at the controls, battling turbulence and an ailing aircraft. Passengers sensed the tension. A woman clutched her child tightly, whispering prayers. A businessman muttered, "This doesn't feel like turbulence. This feels worse." Nervous laughter mixed with panicked voices, the cabin now a storm of fear. The staff tried to calm everyone, but their voices cracked. Their earlier mockery of the quiet man seemed distant now. Survival was suddenly more important than pride. Yet even in this chaos, as they had no idea that the one person capable of saving them was sitting only a few feet away, silent and watchful. The man's fingers tightened briefly on the armrest. His training, his instincts, all of it screamed for him to act. He didn't want recognition, he didn't want praise, but he could not let dozens of lives hang in the balance while he stayed silent. For now, he remained seated, waiting for the moment when the call for help would become desperate enough. He knew it was coming, and when it came, the entire cabin would discover who he really was. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time, and gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers clutched at armrests, voices rising with panic. One flight attendant tried to reassure them, but her voice broke mid-sentence, betraying her fear. Another hurried down the aisle, whispering to her colleague about the co-pilot's sudden collapse. The tension was thick, heavy, pressing down on every heart inside the plane. The man in the front row, quiet until now, watched it all unfold. He had stayed patient, listening, observing, waiting. His sharp eyes had already pieced together what was happening. The captain was alone, battling the controls through worsening turbulence, and the crew had no backup. Every second wasted was another second closer to disaster. He rose from his seat slowly, deliberately, while all eyes turned toward him. The same attendants who had taunted him earlier froze in confusion. Passengers stared as he stood tall in the narrow aisle, steady even as the aircraft shook around him. His calmness cut through the fear like a blade. "I'm a pilot," he said firmly, his voice carrying above the noise. "A certified commercial pilot. Take me to the cockpit. Now." For a moment, silence. The attendants blinked at him, mouths open, unsure if they'd heard correctly. This man, the one they had mocked for looking out of place, was claiming to be their only hope. A passenger spoke up, desperate. "Let him through. If he can help, let him." Others murmured their agreement, fear outweighing doubt. The staff hesitated only a moment longer, then one of them, pale with fear, nodded quickly. "Follow me." The earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by urgency and shame. As the man stepped toward the cockpit, passengers turned in their seats to watch him go. For the first time they saw him not as an ordinary traveler, but as something else. Calm, commanding, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The secret was out. The passenger they had dismissed as unworthy now revealed himself as the one person who could save them all. And as he disappeared behind the cockpit door, the fate of everyone on board shifted into his hands. The cockpit door closed behind him with a heavy click, shutting out the fearful murmurs of the cabin. Inside, the air was different, thicker, urgent. Warning lights flashed on the control panel, and the captain sat rigid in his seat, both hands gripping the yoke as the aircraft fought against violent turbulence. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his eyes darting between instruments, alarms, and the storm of clouds outside. The man, once just another quiet passenger, slid into the co-pilot's seat with practiced ease. His movements were calm, steady, and precise, the kind of confidence that comes only from thousands of hours spent in a cockpit. "I'm a licensed pilot," he said firmly. "Let me help." The captain spared him a quick glance, desperation flickering in his eyes. "My co-pilot collapsed. I can't manage this alone." "I know," the man replied, scanning the controls swiftly. "Let's do this together." Without waiting for hesitation, he reached across the panels, adjusting dials, silencing unnecessary alarms, reading out instrument readings as though he had been sitting there from the start of the flight. His voice carried calm authority, a lifeline to the captain who had been straining under the weight of the crisis. Meanwhile, outside the cockpit, the attendants whispered nervously, exchanging guilty glances. This was the same man they had mocked for being out of place, the same passenger they had belittled with sarcasm. Now he was inside the cockpit, not as a passenger, but as a savior. Their arrogance was replaced by shame and a growing respect. Back inside, the aircraft jolted hard, but the man kept his voice steady, guiding the captain step by step. "Ease the throttle here. Stabilize the angle. Watch the crosswind. I've flown through worse." His calm confidence began to spread, steadying not only the plane, but the captain himself. For the first time since the crisis began, there was a sense of control returning to the cockpit. The turbulence still battered the plane, but now the two men fought it together, one seasoned pilot saving another from collapse under impossible pressure. And as the aircraft slowly steadied, the captain cast another glance at the quiet stranger, now turned co-pilot. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low, incredulous. The man gave a faint smile. "Just someone you shouldn't underestimate." The passengers outside didn't know the details yet, but they could feel it. The plane was slowly leveling, the chaos easing. And though they couldn't see it, the very man they had all overlooked was the one now holding their lives safely in his hands. The storm outside the cockpit window continued to batter the aircraft, clouds rolling like dark waves, lightning flickering far in the distance. The passengers could feel every shudder, every tilt, but slowly, very slowly, the chaos was easing. The once terrified gasps had quieted to nervous murmurs. People could sense it. Control was returning. Inside the cockpit, the two men worked side by side, their voices calm and clipped like seasoned professionals under pressure. The captain, though exhausted, followed the clear commands of his unexpected co-pilot. The man's hands moved over the controls with confidence, adjusting altitude, recalibrating instruments, steadying the aircraft against the storm. Each decision he made pulled the plane back from danger, piece by piece. Back in the cabin, the staff who had earlier mocked him now stood frozen near the galley, exchanging uneasy glances. Shame weighed heavily on them. Only an hour ago, they had whispered cruel remarks about this ordinary-looking man, assuming he didn't belong. And now, he was the only reason they, and everyone else, still had hope of seeing the ground again. Passengers clung to their seats, watching the seatbelt signs glow above them, whispering prayers or holding hands tightly. When the turbulence hit hard again, they braced themselves. But each time, the plane steadied quicker than before, as though someone strong was guiding it through invisible hands. Minutes stretched like hours. The man in the cockpit never faltered, his voice steady, his commands sure. He was no longer just a passenger, he was their rescuer. He had become the difference between despair and survival. And then, gradually, the storm began to fade. The turbulence softened. The engines hummed steadily again. For the first time since the crisis began, a fragile calm returned to the cabin. Passengers lifted their heads, realizing what it had just happened, that the man they had overlooked was carrying them all to safety. The staff, humbled beyond words, could only whisper, "He saved us. He really saved us." But the man himself? He didn't boast, didn't even smile. He kept his eyes on the horizon, focused on guiding the plane until it was truly out of danger. For him, saving lives wasn't about recognition. It was simply what a pilot does. The storm had finally loosened its grip. Outside the windows, the clouds thinned, and the dark sky gave way to streaks of calm blue. Inside the cabin, passengers who had been whispering prayers now sat in stunned silence. The sudden calm felt almost unreal after the chaos they had endured. Slowly, disbelief gave way to relief, and relief to cautious hope. The seatbelt sign remained on, But people began to unclench their fists, to breathe normally again. Mothers hushed their children, travelers exchanged nervous smiles, and the quiet hum of life returned. But their eyes kept drifting to the front, to the closed cockpit door, where their fate had been decided. They didn't know every detail of what had happened in there, but they knew one thing with certainty. The man they had ignored, the man they had doubted, had been the one to save them. The aircraft descended, the lights of the city twinkling far below. The wheels touched down with a thud, smooth and steady, and the plane rolled to a safe stop on the runway. A wave of applause erupted, not the polite kind usually given at landings, but a thunderous, emotional outpouring. Passengers clapped, cheered, and even cried openly. For many, it was the first time they truly felt what survival tasted like. When the cockpit door opened, the man emerged quietly, just as he had boarded hours earlier. He wasn't smiling, nor was he seeking attention. His face remained calm, humble. The captain followed behind him, nodding to the staff to recognize the truth. The attendants who had mocked him earlier now stood frozen. Their cheeks burned with shame. They had laughed at his plain clothes, whispered about how he didn't belong, and rolled their eyes at his polite requests. Now, confronted with the truth, they could barely meet his gaze. One finally found the courage to step forward. "Sir, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. His words were simple, spoken softly, but they carried the weight of the entire journey. Never judge someone by appearances. You don't know what battles they fought, or what skills they carry that might one day save your life. The passengers who overheard those words sat in silence, reflecting on the lesson. It wasn't just about flying or about survival. It was about respect, about humility, about never underestimating another person. The man picked up his modest travel bag and walked calmly down the aisle. No victory speech, no demand for gratitude, just the steady steps of someone who had done his duty and expected nothing more. The cabin erupted in applause again as he disappeared through the exit, leaving behind a plane full of people who would never forget him, or the lesson he had taught them. For the flight staff, the humiliation of their taunts would stay with them. But so too would the reminder. Behind the quietest faces can lie the greatest strength. And for every passenger on that plane, the story became one they would tell for the rest of their lives. A story about the day a humble, unassuming man revealed himself as a hero when the skies threatened to take everything away. The passengers thought the story had ended when the plane touched down, but sometimes the most powerful chapters come after the danger has passed. The man, calm as ever, stepped off the aircraft and walked through the terminal with the same quiet dignity he had carried onto the plane. For him, it was over. Another test, another day of doing what he had been trained to do. But for those who had witnessed it, the experience was just beginning to sink in. News of the mid-air emergency spread quickly. Passengers, still shaken, spoke with reporters, their voices quivering as they described the chaos, the turbulence, the fear. And the moment a man they had thought was ordinary stepped up and saved them all. Videos recorded on phones began circulating online. Clips of the applause, of passengers crying in relief, of staff whispering their gratitude, painted the picture of an unforgettable flight. The man's name wasn't even widely known yet, but the story was already traveling faster than the aircraft itself. The flight staff felt the weight of their guilt long after the doors closed. They had mocked him, belittled him, judged him based on appearances, and then relied on him for their lives. Their shame was sharp, but it came with a valuable lesson they would carry forever. Respect, they realized, costs nothing, but can mean everything. The passengers, too, walked away changed. Some called their families the moment they landed, telling them not just that they were safe, but about the man who had reminded them that real heroes rarely look like the ones in movies. Others sat quietly in the terminal, replaying the nightmarish moments when they thought it was over, only to remember the steady voice and sure hands that had guided them home. And the man? He slipped away quietly, not waiting for interviews or recognition. To him, it was simple. A pilot does what a pilot must. No may, or no less. But for the world, the story became something much larger. It became a story of humility, of hidden strength, of never underestimating a stranger. A story that would live not only in the memories of those on board, but as a reminder shared again and again. That sometimes the quietest person in the room may be the one who saves you when the sky itself turns against you. After landing and after the media attention began to fade, the story of that flight did not simply end. For the man, for the crew, and for the passengers, it became something far bigger, something that lingered in their lives long after the aircraft was parked safely at the gate. The airline itself launched a quiet internal review. They needed to understand not just how the co-pilot had fallen ill, but how their staff had failed to recognize the quiet authority of the man who saved them. Behind closed doors, meetings were held, reports written, and policies discussed. Respect, empathy, and humility were emphasized in new training sessions. It wasn't just about learning how to serve passengers. It was about remembering that each one of them might carry skills or experiences unseen. For the attendants who had taunted him, the guilt was heavy. Some carried it like a shadow, ashamed of the way they had laughed at him, whispering behind his back. Yet they also carried gratitude, because without him, their mistake would have cost lives. They began to treat passengers differently on every future flight, their voices softer, their eyes sharper, never again underestimating a quiet traveler in an old pair of shoes. The passengers told the story everywhere, around dinner tables, in offices, in cafes. They told it not as a tale of turbulence, but as a lesson about human nature. "We judged him by nothing more than his looks," one passenger said in an interview. "But when it mattered most, he was the only one who stood up. We all owe him our lives." As for the man himself, he returned to his quiet life. He did not chase the spotlight, though journalists searched for him. He declined interviews, preferring anonymity over applause. To him, it wasn't heroism. It was duty. He knew that his role was not to be celebrated, but to be ready, to be steady when the skies turned dark. And so, too, his story spread, told in hushed voices, and retold in louder ones, changing with each retelling, but always carrying the same core message. Never underestimate the quiet. Never mock the ordinary. For sometimes, the hero you need most is the one you least expect. That became the final chapter of the flight, not written in logbooks or official reports, but in the hearts of everyone who lived it. A permanent reminder that respect costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything.